Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about having a personal relationship with the gods, receiving communication with the gods, and how weird that is. I think in a lot of the landscape of contemporary paganism, there is this idea which often goes unquestioned, right? We treat it just sort of as implicitly the way that paganism works and should work. There's this idea that you have a close personal relationship with a deity or deities as part of paganism. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about, oh, I have a relationship with who's popular these days, Hecate. And, like, not only do I do ritual, do I make regular offerings to Hecate, but I have kind of a direct line of communication. Whether that is through divination or whether I sort of have some kind of clairaudience or sort of receive messages in visions or in dreams, I have a two-way line of communication open with the deity or deities that I worship as part of my pagan practice. And I am in frequent communication with them. I ask them for advice and guidance on issues in my life, and they respond. That's a very common attitude that you find people have in paganism these days. And it's fascinating to me, because it's weird. Like, if we really stop and think about it, it's weird. It's weird to think, first off, like, it's just weird to believe in gods, but like that's a baseline of weird that we're all accepting. But it's weird to think that we have the kind of direct and privileged access to the gods, where these big, like, universal, transcendent cosmic forces listen to us, pay attention to us, and respond to us in that intimate and conversational way, where the gods are not just communicating to us about big events or big things, but you often hear people who are like, struggling to make a decision about whatever, whether to break up with a lover or whether to make a big move or, something like that. And the way that a lot of people in paganism will talk about that is they'll say, I went to my altar, I prayed, and I asked the Dagda for guidance, and he responded, and I got a sign that indicated I should do X, Y, and Z. And I'm really intrigued by that. And I should say, right, this is also a behavior that I exhibit too. I'm not trying to crap on something that other people do and I don't. This is behavior that I participate in, that I exhibit, and that I'm interrogating as someone who does it. Because I think if we look at a lot of the landscape of historical paganism, that's really not how people seem to have interacted with their gods. You look at a lot of historical paganism, and yes, there was private religion, right? People had like their own practices. People had their own devotional relationship to certain gods. People had folk religion, which was often very syncretic and personal in ways that, like, formal temple religion was not. But broadly speaking, like, especially if you think about temple religion, there are certain circumstances in which people expected to receive direct communication from gods, but it's not all that common in the way that historical paganism describes the relationships with the gods. Like, the big one that I can think of is the Temple of Asclepius, where you would go and you would make a sacrifice, and then you would spend the night in the temple and hope to receive a dream from the god that indicated how your sacrifice had been received and how you should proceed. Like, that's a very clear instance of people, ordinary, everyday people, having direct communication with the gods. But a lot of the time, there were mediators, right? There were intermediaries between you and the gods. You would go to the temple and you would make a sacrifice in the temple, or you would consult with a priest or priestess, and there were people who were sort of designated as this class of priesthood who were intermediaries and who would communicate with the gods on your behalf, but then who would also communicate with you on behalf of the gods, who would perform divination, divine omens, whatever it might be, and then communicate the results to you. And this is not just paganism, right? This is also a whole host of other religions. Like, often in religions where there is a laity and a clergy, part of the role that the clergy performs is as an intermediary between the laity and the gods, where you're communicating in both directions. Um, and again, that's not to say that religion doesn't exist or hasn't existed outside of formal temple contexts and formal relationships with clergy, because obviously that has always been the case, right? Like, people are always praying directly. But I think in a lot of cases, both in historical paganism and elsewhere, it's much less common, not unheard of, but much less common for people to have the kinds of relationship with a deity where they talk directly to that deity and the deity is expected to talk directly back. And yet that seems to be a really common attitude in paganism. And honestly, I think part of it is here's Thorn Mooney talking, right? Like, here is the product of several conversations that I've had with Thorn, because this is a drum that she likes to beat. But I think that part of it is the influence of Protestant Christianity on a lot of mainstream American culture, and how that kind of seeps into the ways that we think about religion in general. Right. One of the hallmarks of the Protestant Reformation was the idea that people could speak directly to God without needing the priesthood as an intermediary, and that God will talk back, that you can communicate with God, and that you can expect God to communicate directly with you. That's a big part of Protestantism. And then especially when you get Protestantism as it comes to the United States, there are certain brands of Protestant Christianity that emerge, especially during the Great Awakening here in the US, that really emphasize that direct communion with God, and in some cases an ecstatic communion with God. So if you think about like Pentecostal or charismatic Christians, this idea of being moved directly by the Holy Spirit, having God speak through you, admittedly in some cases speaking in tongues, but the idea that God is directly accessible, can be communicated with, and that all of us have that like direct line to the divine. Even for those of us who aren't Christian, weren't raised in those more fringe denominations of Christianity, the idea that if there is a God or gods, that whatever the divine is, that we have a direct line to it, and that we can talk to it and expect it to talk back, I think is very strongly influenced by this kind of general assumption about religion that comes from a Protestant Christian context. That is not to say that it is only influenced by Protestant Christianity. That is not to say that people doing paganism are all actually secretly Protestants. Like, I'm not saying any of that. But I think that there is a certain cultural assumption that a lot of people in America in particular have about what a relationship with the divine looks like. And when people come into paganism, I think a lot of us import that cultural assumption along with our practice. And that leads to a kind of practice where we talk to the gods directly, and we often expect to be able to receive some direct communication back. And I think if we, right, there are other models of paganism. In particular, I don't really spend a lot of time in the Slavic polytheist community anymore. I was never really in the community, but I don't really do Slavic polytheism anymore for reasons that I've discussed. But in Slavic polytheism, it's actually very uncommon for people to try to communicate directly with the gods, or for people to talk about receiving communication from the gods. Slavic polytheism tends to view the gods as kind of further removed. They're a little bit more cosmic. They're more concerned with kind of the big goings on in the world. And if you have specific issues or things that you need to pray about or intercession that you're going to ask for, in that community you are typically going to ancestral spirits or spirits of the land rather than going directly to the gods. And the same is true of certain other types of like polytheist religious communities, right? Like, it exists in paganism, is what I'm trying to say. But I think a lot of why we have that attitude about having the direct communication with the gods is because of this general context. And obviously, when I'm saying that there's a cultural assumption in America, this should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I am referring only to the practice of paganism in the United States when I talk about that. American cultural hegemony exists, and there's a certain extent to which it touches on the assumptions that people make in the rest of the world, just because like American culture is so insidious and pervasive. But I'm not trying to say that like the culture of modern paganism in Italy comes out of this cultural assumption that comes from American Protestantism. Like, that's not at all what I'm trying to say, so don't come for me in the comments. But I think in the US, I do think that kind of implicit shadow of Protestant Christianity and Protestant assumptions about what it means to have a relationship with the divine, I think that's present. I think the other thing that's present is that we don't really have an established body of clergy in a lot of paganism, the way that there was historically, or the way that there is in certain kinds of larger religious communities like Christianity. And even within Christianity, that gets complicated. But like, there are specific groups, traditions, or organizations that may have a priesthood or a clergy of some kind. So you may find organizations like OBOD that have kind of a structure of processing through and gaining wisdom and experience and maybe deepening your relationships with the gods. You may have specific initiatory traditions like my tradition, Gardnerian Wicca. But most of paganism, kind of just out generally in the world, doesn't really have clergy the way that you see in other religious communities. And we certainly don't have the strong distinction between clergy and laity that you see in other communities. So like even within Gardnerian community, Gardnerian Wicca, right? Like we have a priesthood, and that means certain things, and I've talked about that before, but we really don't have a laity in Gardnerian Wicca. Everyone who is an initiate of Gardnerian Wicca is a part of the priesthood. So that distinction between clergy and laity kind of disappears. And I think that if you're going to have a religious community in which communication with the gods is mediated by a priesthood, you do actually have to have that distinction between priesthood and laity, because otherwise it makes no sense to have an intermediary there. And to a certain extent, I actually do think it is sometimes beneficial to have a formalized intermediary in certain types of relationships with the gods, right? There are trade-offs, there are pros and cons. But I think that in a lot of contemporary paganism where we're relying on direct communication, like me to the gods, it can be very difficult to check yourself and to exercise discernment, because it can be very easy to tell yourself what you want to hear and say that it's coming from the gods, right? This is human nature. I do it, everyone does it, right? Like, it's very, very easy to just kind of listen to the voice in your head that's telling you what you want to do and hearing it as communication from the divine. And I think that when we have more formalized processes or more formalized intermediaries, that can help to kind of instill some checks and balances. Right? There is a reason that if I have a really difficult question for divination, I will often not read for myself. I will often go to another diviner whose experience and skill I trust, and I will ask them to perform that divination for me, because I can't be objective about it. And I think something similar applies to communication with the gods. And obviously those two things can kind of come together, because a lot of people use formal divination tools like tarot as a means of communication with the gods. But like, if you can't trust yourself to interpret the divination in a way that isn't just what you want or expect to see, it's helpful to have someone else that you can trust, that you can go to and ask them to conduct that communication for you. Likewise, I think about like the specific context of my tradition, and we have formalized processes that aid in communication with the gods, right? We have specific ritual or magical contexts in which we're going to seek communication with the gods in one way or another. And those are going to vary a little bit from one coven to the next. Like, you know, certain lineages or covens or individual practitioners might have techniques that they use that aren't universal across the tradition. But I think that broadly speaking, it is very common for groups within initiatory Wicca to have some kind of a formalized setup that aids them in communicating with the gods or in trying to receive messages from the gods. And that helps. It really helps because it puts a formal delineation on the time when you are trying to receive that communication, when you're trying to receive signs or whatever else it may be from the gods. And that just helps with discernment, right? It helps to know that in this context, because I have just done this magical action, I can now, whatever, pull my tarot cards or look for an omen, interpret that message from the gods in a particular way because I have formally asked for that communication and I have received something that I have designated as the thing to be interpreted, rather than just kind of floating through life and seeing something that feels like a coincidence, maybe might feel significant, and trying to decide whether I need to interpret that as communication from the gods. I think, and here's, right, like here's the traditionalist in me speaking, but I think it's really easy to get overwhelmed if you don't have formal processes or formal intermediaries. I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed and not to know which things you should be interpreting as communication from the gods versus which things you just kind of chalk up to like a coincidence happens and that's life. And when we implement formal ritual or magical processes, when we have someone who is sort of in a designated position, even just for the purpose of like a single ritual or a single evening, but when we have someone who is designated as an intermediary who's managing that communication between us and the gods, I think it's a lot easier to draw those boundaries and to be clear about where my personal thoughts begin and where they end, and then where we have the gods. And, you know, like, and again, I'm guilty of this as much as the next girl. But every now and then someone talks about a communication that they received from the gods, and I'm like, this feels a little bit self-indulgent. This feels a little bit like you kind of just made something up and then decided that it was whatever Caradwen who communicated this to you. And again, like, it's something I've done as well. I think it's really human nature to kind of fall into that trap. But that's why I think it's helpful to really think about, if we are practicing a kind of paganism where we expect that there are direct forms of communication with gods or spirits, what kind of limitations, boundaries, or expectations are we putting on that communication in order to help keep ourselves in check? Because I think that's an important thing to do. So anyway, that's all I've got for today. Happy Yule coming up for all who celebrate it in the Northern Hemisphere. Happy Midsummer for those down south. And I'll talk to you sometime soon. Bye.